This is part 2 of the video series on water for Bio 120, and so I recommend that you watch part 1 before you come to part 2. So building off of part 1, here we're going to look at important properties of water. And in your chart that you have as you study water that you're filling in, you can see that there's many important properties of water that life depends upon. Here, though, we want to look at 3 important properties, and those are listed in blue on this slide. So here we're going to look at the solvent properties of water. Water is actually known as a universal solvent. We're going to look at how water actually organizes other molecules and how water can form ions. And because water forms ions, that's why we are interested in the pH of solutions and acids and bases. So to begin with, starting with point 4 from the previous slide, water is an excellent solvent. So when we talk about solvents, we have to understand some definitions. So let's start at the end. Ultimately, all of us are familiar with solutions. So a solution is a homogeneous mixture of 2 or more evenly dissolved substances. So think about liquids that you have seen that are uniform distribution. Soda, salt water, mouthwash. All of those are solutions because it is very hard for you to physically separate out the different components that are in those solutions. But nevertheless, there are different chemicals that make up those solutions. And so we have 2 other definitions that we consider when we're talking about solutions. The first one is a solute. So a solute is a molecule that gets dissolved in the solution. So here in our picture, these yellow circles are our solutes. They're going to get dissolved in the solution and become equally distributed. So the medium that the solute gets dissolved into is called the solvent. And so in many chemical reactions, the solvent is water. When you consider that the body, on average, is about 72% water, and even if we were then to look at cells, cells are about 70% water, you can see why water is going to be a solvent. It makes up the majority of living organisms. And so water being a universal solvent is actually very biologically important. Most of the chemical reactions or the biological reactions that take place in cells are going to be happening because they can take place in water. Now, why does water dissolve many different types of substances? Well, why it works is because of the structure of water. Remember from our previous video that water is a polar molecule. It has it's a dipole. It has a positive side and a negative side. So water actually attracts different types of molecules. Here you could see the negative side of the water is attracted to a positively charged molecule, and the positive sides of water are attracted to other electronegative molecules. And so water, because of its polarity, is able to attract many different kinds of substances. So here's something to think about. Table salt's an ionic compound because it's made of sodiums, which are positive, chlorides, which are negative, and most people are familiar with salt water. Either you know that our oceans are made of salt water, or perhaps you've gargled with salt water for a sore throat, or you've made salt water. So most people know that if you put table salt into water, it dissolves. So I want you to pause the video and draw molecules of sodium and chloride, just like they are in the picture here, and how water would be attracted to those. After you've made your drawing, you should have something that looks like this, where the negative side of a water molecule is attracted to the positive sodiums, and the positive sides, that are the hydrogen sides of the water molecule, are attracted to the negative chloride atoms. And so you can see as water sneaks its way in there and it starts to break apart the sodium and chloride bonds, water surrounds those atoms, and as it does, the salt will dissolve in the water. Water can also do this to non-ionic polar molecules. So a very large molecule might be something like a protein, and you have many proteins in cells, you have many proteins that are going to be in the blood. And so proteins can be non-ionic polar molecules. And so just like water can break apart the sodium and the chloride, the water can surround and create hydration cells around polar molecules. So here is a protein, and you can see it's actually dissolved in the water because as the water comes up to it, you can see on negative parts of this protein molecule, we're attracting positive sides of our water molecules, and on positive sides of this polar molecule is attracted to the negative sides of our water molecules. And so because of these properties, water starts to organize molecules. And as we look at how water can organize molecules, we have to look at three more vocabulary words. So molecules that attract water are generally polar, like we've seen with our salt or our sodium chloride example. So molecules that attract water are called hydrophilic. If you break down hydrophilic, hydro means water, philic means loving, so water loving. Hydrophobic molecules are the opposite. Hydrophobic molecules repel water, and most of the times these molecules are nonpolar or they are fats. So if we break apart the word hydrophobic, hydro for water, phobic means fear of. So these molecules have a fear of water. They run from water, or they are repelled by the water molecules. And so what we see is that nonpolar or hydrophobic molecules actually exclude water. And to be able to exclude water, they start to aggregate together. And this has biological importance as well. So by forcing hydrophobic portions of molecules together, it actually helps to define shapes of biological macromolecules. And structure and function always go together. So a great example of this in a way that you have seen hydrophobic or hydrophilic molecules is think of a bottle of Italian salad dressing where on the bottom you see an oil layer and on the top you see the vinegar. The reason why that dressing has separated is because the oil is hydrophobic. It's a fat, it's not polar, so it excludes and repels water, and so those molecules cluster together at the bottom of the bottle. An example of this in a cell are phospholipids. So this is a picture of a phospholipid. A phospholipid is interesting because part of the molecule, called the head, is hydrophilic or water-loving, and part of it, which are the fatty acid tails, are actually hydrophobic or water-repelling. And so because these tails do not want to be by water, the tails of multiple phospholipids will actually gather together, and they will point towards one another and away from water. And so that's how phospholipids actually form cell membranes. So here you can see all of those hydrophilic heads are facing outside of the cell or inside the cell where there is water present. And the hydrophilic tails all cluster together and exclude water. Even proteins and how they insert themselves into the membrane follow these principles of being hydrophilic or hydrophobic. So amino acids can either be polar or nonpolar. So the polar amino acids, like water, the nonpolar amino acids are hydrophobic, they exclude water. So here is a giant protein that's going to insert into a cell membrane. And within this one protein, there are still going to be hydrophilic and hydrophobic areas. So as this protein folded up and inserted into the membrane, areas that are nonpolar actually stick in the membrane in the hydrophobic region because these amino acids are hydrophobic. The areas of this major protein that are polar, so they have polar amino acids, are hydrophilic, and so they're in the hydrophilic regions. They point outside the cell or inside the cell, and so it allows this protein to stay anchored in the right conformation and in the right direction in the cell membrane. Lastly, water can form ions, and we call this ionization. So here's a water molecule, and water molecules can dissociate or break apart. And when they do, they form hydroxide ions, you could see it here as OH negative, and hydrogen ions, which is written in H+. And so we have a negative and a positive ion that result. Most equations in most textbooks will write this equation just like it is on this slide. However, hydrogen ions really don't exist on their own in water. So normally they will bind to another water molecule, and when they do, they make hydronium, so that's H3O, or they will recombine with hydroxide and make water again. But this is actually biologically important because when you have water, it will dissociate, and when it does, we make this hydrogen and hydroxide. These ions are actually very reactive, and if their concentrations change, they actually start to shift the acidity or the alkalinity of a solution. And these changes or shifts lead to shifts in pH. And pH is very significant to biological systems because our proteins, our cells, and our organs all like to be around a neutral pH. And so in our next video, we're going to explore pH in more depth.